Hello everybody and welcome back to another EP video. As you have probably noticed by now, unless you've been living under a rock, our current political environment is extremely partisan and polarized. We are currently in the midst of an unprecedented run of close, competitive elections, and Democrats and Republicans are just about as far apart ideologically as they have ever been. Many of them, both in government in DC and spread out across the country, also feel a strong hatred towards each other, to the point that most believe that the other side fundamentally differs not just in its priorities but in its core values too. As a country, we have evolved from "I don't agree with you" to "I don't like you" to "you are an evil that must be stopped." And as a result, very few voters split their tickets in November. That is, if they voted for one party for president, they probably also voted for the same party up and down the ballot. For example, take how voters cast their ballots in the US House elections, which is the only other national election in 2020 aside from the presidential election, given that the presidential race is on the ballot everywhere, as are all of the 435 House seats. But just 16 out of the 435 districts backed a presidential nominee from one party and a House candidate from another party. That translates to just 4% of districts splitting their tickets in 2020, the smallest share in the past 70 years. That number is pretty concerning, and it speaks to how deeply anchored partisanship is in our elections. But as this chart shows, this cycle is not the first time that this has been the case. Over the past 20 years, the share of districts splitting their House and presidential results between the two major parties has consistently fallen below 20%, and 2020 was the third consecutive cycle that it fell below 10%. Now, this represents a major change from much of the latter half of the 20th century, when all but one cycle, 1952, topped 20%. In fact, we would have to go back to the start of the 20th century to find a similar period with such small share of crossover seats, between 1900 and 1908. What is causing this surge of straight ticket outcomes is a sharp increase in the one-to-one relationship between presidential and House voting. The correlation between the presidential and House vote margin in each district was far greater in 2020 than in 2000, just 2 decades prior. Based on various calculations, the 2020 presidential vote explained more than 85% of the variation in the House vote last November, whereas it explained only 30% of the variation in 2000. Now, this does not mean that the few districts that did split their outcomes in 2020 were not significant. Rather, they were illustrative of why the Democrats ended up with a narrow majority in the House. That's because in these 16 districts, the GOP did slightly better than Democrats overall. And not just because Republicans won 9 of these districts compared with the Democrats' 7. The GOP also notably won the 4 closest races in these districts, and carried 6 of the 7 seats with the largest gap between the House and presidential vote. In fact, of the 14 House seats that the GOP flipped in 2020, 4 of them were from the 16 crossover districts. The GOP's slight edge in these crossover seats is telling, as it continues a recent pattern in presidential contests of Republicans winning more districts with split outcomes. Democrats previously held this advantage from 2000 to 2008, but in 2010 they lost many seats in the South that had long been in their hands despite voters leaning toward the GOP at the presidential level. However, while the GOP may have done somewhat better in the crossover seats in 2020, they still proved to be pivotal to the Democrats' majority. The Democratic Party now holds 222 seats in the House of Representatives overall, and that is in large part thanks to these seats. In total, the average gap between the presidential and House margins in these 16 crossover seats was about 9.2 points, while the average difference in the remaining House seats was 4.4 points, indicative of just how close the presidential and House races ran together. And ultimately, that close alignment will likely be the reality moving forward. Even if the number of crossover seats increases in 2024, it would take a dramatic shift in our politics for enough voters to split their tickets to produce a lot of Democratic House members in seats carried by the GOP presidential nominee or vice versa. Now more than ever, these split ticket outcomes are the exception, not the rule. That is all for today's video. I hope you all enjoyed. Please make sure to follow my personal Instagram and EP Official on all social medias shown on screen and linked in the description down below. Also, make sure to comment your thoughts and opinions in the comment section, and please hit the like button if you liked the video as well. Subscribe if you haven't already. Thank you all so much for watching. Check out more content from my channel here, and as always, tune in next time. EP out.